Sometimes the most broken hearts find each other when they need it most. Will Cutter had given up on companionship until a dying puppy crawled under his bed one frozen Montana morning. The old mountain man nursed the little dog back to health, calling her Lucky. For 4 weeks, she brought warmth to his lonely cabin and reminded him what it felt like to care about something again. Then one day Lucky wandered into the woods, and Will followed her deeper into the wilderness than he'd been in years. What she led him to would change his life forever. But what was buried in that remote mountain valley that only a dog could find? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Will Cutter had been alone in these Montana mountains for 15 winters, and he'd convinced himself that was exactly how he preferred it. His cabin sat perched on a natural shelf of granite, tucked between towering pines that had stood sentinel here long before the first trappers ever set foot in this territory. The structure itself told the story of a man who'd built for permanence but lived for solitude. Thick logs chinked tight against the mountain cold, a stone chimney that drew clean, and windows positioned to catch the morning light but reveal nothing to prying eyes. Inside, everything had its place and purpose. The single room served as kitchen, parlor, and bedroom, with a stone hearth dominating the far wall. Above the mantelpiece, wrapped in oiled leather, sat a tarnished Civil War medal in a small wooden box, the only remaining piece of his younger brother Thomas, or so Will believed. He rarely opened that box anymore. The weight of what it represented had grown too heavy to bear, even after all these years. Will's daily routine had become as predictable as the mountain sunrise. He rose before dawn, stoked the fire, and set coffee to boil in a battered tin pot. While it brewed, he'd step onto his covered porch and study the weather, reading the signs in the clouds and wind that would determine his day's work. Trapping season demanded constant attention, checking snares, maintaining trap lines, and processing pelts with the methodical precision of a man who'd turned survival into an art form. The war had taught him discipline, but these mountains had taught him patience. As a young soldier fighting for the Union, Will had been all fire and urgency, eager to prove himself worthy of the family name. He'd enlisted alongside Thomas, his younger brother, by 3 years, both of them filled with righteous conviction and the invincible confidence of youth. They'd planned to serve together, watch each other's backs, and return home to Nebraska as heroes. Instead, Will had watched Thomas fall during the Battle of Spotsylvania, cut down by Confederate grape shot while trying to rally a broken line. The image had burned itself into Will's memory with the permanence of a brand. Thomas, turning back to shout encouragement, his face bright with that reckless courage that had always defined him. And then, the explosion of dirt and smoke that took him forever. Will had carried Thomas's body from that field himself, refusing to let the burial detail handle his brother like just another casualty. He'd written the letter to their parents, served out his enlistment with mechanical efficiency, and then headed west with no particular destination in mind. The Montana Territory had simply been far enough from everything that reminded him of the life he'd lost. For 15 years, he'd trapped these mountains with single-minded focus, building a reputation among the scattered trading posts as a reliable supplier of quality pelts. He dealt fairly but briefly with other men, never staying long enough in any settlement for friendships to develop. His cabin had no neighbors within 20 miles, exactly as he'd planned when he'd chosen this isolated valley. The work suited his temperament, long periods of solitude, broken by brief, purposeful activity. Checking trap lines required, covering vast territories on snowshoes or horseback, reading animal signs, and maintaining the delicate balance between taking enough pelts to survive and preserving the populations that sustained his livelihood. It was honest work that demanded skill, but it allowed a man to avoid the complications of human connection. Winter evenings found him reading by firelight books, ordered from distant catalogues and delivered with supply runs. He favored practical volumes on engineering and agriculture, though he'd kept a worn copy of Shakespeare's tragedies that had somehow survived his westward journey. Sometimes he'd read passages aloud to break the silence, his voice rusty from disuse echoing off the cabin walls. His conversations were limited to brief exchanges with other trappers he occasionally encountered on the trails, and the more substantial but infrequent interactions with Jake Morrison, who ran the trading post in Beaver Creek 40 miles to the south. Jake had tried over the years to draw Will into longer discussions, perhaps sensing the education and refinement beneath the mountain man's weathered exterior. But Will had always kept such encounters strictly business. The isolation had carved lines into Will's face that had nothing to do with weather exposure. At 42, his dark hair showed threads of silver, and his green eyes held the watchful stillness of a man who'd seen too much and expected too little. He'd grown lean and hard from mountain living, his hands scarred from countless small injuries that came with wilderness survival. The work had kept him strong, but the loneliness had worn grooves in his soul that he'd learned to ignore rather than heal. He told himself he'd found peace in this solitary existence. The mountains demanded nothing from him except competence and respect for their own power. They didn't ask questions about his past or harbor expectations about his future. In return, they provided everything he needed to survive: game for meat, streams for water, timber for fuel, and an endless supply of silence to fill the spaces where other men might seek conversation. His nearest neighbors were the creatures he trapped: wolverines, martens, foxes, and the occasional wolf pack that drifted through his territory following game migrations. He'd learned their habits and patterns with the thoroughness of a naturalist, understanding their behaviors well enough to predict their movements seasons in advance. In some strange way, he felt more kinship with these wild animals than he had with any human being since Thomas died. The cabin itself reflected his practical nature and emotional distance from the world beyond these mountains. Everything was built to last and function efficiently, but nothing was built for beauty or comfort beyond basic necessity. The single bed was sturdy but narrow. The table served for eating and working, but held no decorations. The walls displayed only the tools he needed for his work: traps, snowshoes, rifles, and the various implements that kept him alive in this harsh environment. He'd never hung pictures or arranged objects for aesthetic pleasure. The only personal item visible was that wooden box above the mantel, and even that stayed closed most days. Will had trained himself to live without sentiment, believing it a luxury he couldn't afford and a weakness he couldn't risk. Yet sometimes, in the deep quiet of winter nights, when the wind howled through the pines and snow pressed against his windows like searching fingers, Will caught himself listening for sounds that never came: a voice calling his name, footsteps on the porch, or the simple presence of another heartbeat sharing the warmth of his fire. In those moments, he recognized the hollow ache of loneliness that no amount of self-sufficiency could fill. But morning always came with its familiar demands, and Will would rise to meet another day with the same methodical determination that had carried him through 15 years of chosen isolation. He'd convinced himself that this was enough, that a man could live a complete life with nothing more than work, shelter, and the vast, indifferent beauty of the wilderness. He'd been wrong about that, though he wouldn't understand just how wrong until a dying puppy crawled beneath his bed seeking warmth and shelter, bringing with her the first crack in the walls he'd built around his heart. The mountains had taught Will many things about survival, but they had never taught him how to live again. That lesson would come from an unexpected teacher, in a form so small and fragile that he almost missed the sound of her arrival entirely. The morning of February 12th, 1873, arrived with the kind of cold that made a man question his decision to live in the mountains. Will woke to the sound of wind driving snow against his windows with the persistence of thrown gravel, and when he stepped outside to check his thermometer, the mercury had dropped so low it barely registered on the scale. He'd planned to ride his trapline that day, but the storm had other ideas. Ice coated everything in a crystalline shell that made travel treacherous, and the wind carried the kind of bite that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Even for a man accustomed to Montana winters, this was weather that demanded respect and caution. Instead of venturing out, Will decided to tackle some overdue maintenance inside the cabin. The roof had developed a small leak near the chimney, allowing melted snow to drip steadily into a tin bucket he'd positioned to catch the worst of it. The rhythmic pinging had been driving him to distraction for weeks, and the forced confinement of the storm gave him the perfect opportunity to address it from the inside. He moved his furniture away from the affected area and climbed onto a chair to examine the ceiling more closely. The logs were sound, but the chinking between them had dried and cracked, creating a gap just wide enough to admit moisture. He'd need to clean out the old material and replace it with fresh clay and moss, tedious work, but necessary if he wanted to stay dry through the rest of winter. As he scraped away the deteriorated chinking with his knife, absorbed in the methodical rhythm of the task, Will heard something that made him pause. It was so faint at first that he thought it might be the wind finding a new way through the cabin's gaps, but as he listened more carefully, he realized it was something else entirely. A whimper, soft, weak, and unmistakably distressed. Will climbed down from his chair and stood perfectly still, listening. The sound came again, a pitiful cry that seemed to originate somewhere near the floor. He knelt and pressed his ear to the rough planking, trying to locate the source. The whimpering grew slightly louder, and he realized it was coming from beneath his bed. Moving to the foot of his narrow cot, Will lowered himself to the floor and peered into the shadows underneath. At first, he saw nothing but dust and the chamber pot he kept there for emergencies. Then his eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he made out a small, dark shape pressed against the far wall. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured, reaching carefully toward the huddled form. His fingers encountered matted fur, cold to the touch and sticky with what felt like blood. The puppy, for that's what it was, no bigger than his cupped hands, whimpered again when he touched her, but she was too weak to pull away. Gently, Will coaxed her toward him, speaking in the low, calm tones he used with spooked horses. "Easy now, little one. Easy. Let's have a look at you." When he finally drew her into the firelight, his heart clenched at what he saw. The puppy was barely alive, her ribs showing through. Patchy fur that was matted with burrs, dried blood, and ice. One of her ears was torn, and scratches covered her muzzle and legs. Around her neck, tangled in the fur, was a small piece of red fabric, part of what had once been a bandana, now torn and filthy. She couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old, with the oversized paws and soft features of a pup that would grow into something substantial if she lived long enough. Her breed was uncertain, some mix of working dog bloodlines that were common in mining and trapping country. Her coat, beneath the grime and matted fur, showed traces of brown and black, with white markings on her chest and paws. Will held her gently, feeling how little she weighed and how cold her small body had become. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, her eyes barely open. She was dying, and they both knew it. For a long moment, he simply sat on his floor, holding this fragile life in his hands, wrestling with impulses he'd thought long buried. The practical part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive and self-sufficient for 15 years, told him this was nature's way. Puppies died in the wilderness all the time. He'd seen it happen to wolf litters when the hunting was poor or when disease swept through a pack. It was unfortunate, but it wasn't his responsibility. But as he looked down at her small face, Will saw something in her dark eyes that reminded him uncomfortably of himself, a stubborn refusal to quit, even when quitting would be easier. She was fighting to live with the same desperate determination that had carried him through the war and the bitter years that followed. "Where did you come from, little one?" he asked softly. "And how in blazes did you get under my bed?" The mystery troubled him. His cabin was well sealed against the weather, and he kept the door latched securely. There were no obvious gaps large enough for a puppy to squeeze through, especially one in her condition. Yet here she was, having somehow found her way to the one warm, dry space she could reach. Against his better judgment, Will found himself moving toward his kitchen area, the puppy cradled carefully in one arm. He put water on to warm, then searched through his supplies for something she might be able to digest. His stores included jerky, hardtack, coffee, beans, and flour, none of it suitable for a dying animal. Then he remembered the small tin of condensed milk he kept for emergencies. It was expensive and precious in this remote location, but as he looked down at the puppy's wan face, Will realized he'd already made his decision. He warmed the milk carefully, diluting it with water until it was just body temperature, then dipped his finger and touched it to her lips. At first, she showed no interest, but when a drop ran across her tongue, her eyes opened wider and she began to lap weakly at his fingertip. "That's it," he encouraged, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "Take what you can." The feeding was slow and painstaking. She could only manage a few drops at a time before exhaustion overcame her, but gradually she began to show more awareness of her surroundings. Will fashioned a small bed near the fire using an old wool shirt, wrapping her carefully to preserve what little body heat she had. As he worked to clean her wounds with warm water and gentle pressure, Will found himself talking to her in ways he hadn't spoken to any living creature since the war. He told her about the storm raging outside, about his trap lines and the animals he shared these mountains with, about anything that came to mind just to fill the silence with something other than her labored breathing. The torn red bandana puzzled him. Someone had cared enough about this puppy to put it on her, which meant she'd had an owner somewhere. But how had she ended up alone and dying in the wilderness, and how had she found her way specifically to his cabin? The nearest settlement was 40 miles away, too far for a puppy to travel on her own, especially in this condition. By evening, she was taking milk more readily and had even managed to lift her head when he approached. Will found himself checking on her constantly, adjusting her bedding, offering more food, and simply watching her chest rise and fall with the fascination of a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to worry about someone else's welfare. That night, he moved her makeshift bed closer to his own cot so he could monitor her breathing. As he lay listening to the storm gradually subside outside, Will realized that something fundamental had shifted in his carefully ordered existence. For the first time in 15 years, another heartbeat shared the warmth of his fire, and against all his expectations, the sound didn't frighten him. It gave him hope. 3 days after the storm passed, the puppy opened her eyes fully for the first time and looked directly at Will with an intelligence that surprised him. The milky blue of newborn puppies had already begun to darken toward brown, and there was an alertness in her gaze that spoke of a quick mind assessing her surroundings. "Well, hello there," Will said softly, setting down the trap he'd been repairing. "Feeling better, are we?" She responded by attempting to stand on shaking legs, managing to hold herself upright for several seconds before settling back down with what sounded remarkably like a sigh of frustration. Will found himself smiling, an expression that felt foreign on his weathered face after so many years of disuse. Her recovery progressed with encouraging speed. By the end of the first week, she was taking warmed milk readily and had even begun to show interest in small pieces of jerky that Will softened in warm water. Her wounds were healing cleanly, though the torn ear would always mark her as a survivor of some difficult experience. Will found himself restructuring his daily routine around her needs. He woke earlier to warm milk and check on her condition. His trapline visits became shorter and more efficient, driven by an unexpected eagerness to return to the cabin. In the evenings, instead of reading in solitary silence, he found himself talking to her about his day, describing the tracks he'd seen and the changes in weather patterns that would affect his work. "You're going to need a name," he told her one morning, as she investigated a piece of jerky with the focused intensity of a born hunter. "Can't keep calling you little one forever." She looked up at him with those increasingly dark eyes, and something in her expression reminded him of a conversation he'd had with Thomas years ago, before the war changed everything. They'd been discussing their father's old hunting dog, a clever hound named Lucky, who'd had an uncanny ability to find game when the family needed meat most. "Lucky," Will said aloud, testing how it sounded. "That work for you?" As if in response, the puppy's tail moved, in what might have been her first attempt at wagging, and Will felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. The name suited her in ways he hadn't expected. Lucky seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to be exactly where she was needed most. When Will worked near the fire, she positioned herself close enough to provide companionship without getting in his way. When he moved to his workbench, she followed and settled nearby, content to watch his hands as he repaired equipment or prepared pelts for trading. More surprisingly, she showed an immediate understanding of cabin etiquette that suggested either remarkable intelligence or previous training. She quickly learned to relieve herself near the door, signaling when she needed to go outside. She never chewed on his possessions or disturbed his carefully organized supplies. Instead, she seemed to study his routines with the attention of a scholar, learning the rhythms of their shared life with impressive speed. As Lucky grew stronger, Will began to notice quirks in her behavior that intrigued him. She showed particular interest in certain objects around the cabin, especially anything made of metal or leather. When he brought out his prospecting pan to use as a water dish for her, she spent long minutes sniffing and investigating it with an intensity that seemed unusual for a puppy. Most mysteriously, she reacted strongly to music. Will had a habit of humming old war songs while he worked, melodies that helped pass the time during repetitive tasks. Lucky would become very still whenever he hummed, tilting her head and listening with an almost human expression of concentration. The discovery that made him truly curious happened on a quiet evening when he decided to clean out an old chest he'd inherited with the cabin. Among the previous owner's belongings, he found a small wooden whistle, carved with simple but elegant designs. When he blew a few experimental notes, Lucky's response was immediate and startling. She came alert, as if struck by lightning, her ears pricked forward and her entire body tense with attention. Then she began to whine, not in distress, but with what sounded like recognition or even longing. When he stopped playing, she approached the whistle cautiously, sniffing it with the same intense interest she'd shown the prospecting pan. "You know this tune, don't you, girl?" Will asked, examining the whistle more closely. The carving was excellent work, the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of patient skill and genuine artistry. "Someone played music for you before you found your way here." The thought troubled him more than he cared to admit. Lucky's obvious familiarity with human customs and her reaction to specific objects suggested she'd lived with someone who'd cared for her, trained her, and probably loved her, which raised uncomfortable questions about how she'd ended up alone and dying in the wilderness, and why no one had come looking for her. Will began paying closer attention to her behavior, looking for other clues about her past. She showed no fear of men's voices or sudden movements, suggesting she'd been treated kindly by her previous owner. Her quick learning and eager response to gentle commands indicated someone had already begun her training with patience and skill. But she also displayed behaviors that puzzled him. Sometimes she would position herself near the cabin's windows and stare intently toward the western mountains, as if watching for something or someone. Other times, she would investigate corners and spaces with the methodical thoroughness of an animal, searching for something specific. "What are you looking for, Lucky?" he asked one afternoon, watching her nose carefully around the base of his woodpile. "What do you think you're going to find here?" She looked up at him with those increasingly expressive eyes, and Will could swear he saw frustration in her gaze, as if she was trying to communicate something important that he wasn't understanding. Despite the mysteries surrounding her arrival and behavior, Lucky's presence had begun to transform Will's existence in ways he was only beginning to recognize. The cabin felt less empty with her small form curled near the fire. The silence that had once seemed peaceful now felt incomplete when she was napping and not providing her soft breathing as accompaniment to his work. More significantly, Will found himself planning for the future in ways he hadn't done since the war. He considered what supplies she would need as she grew larger, how to modify his trapline schedule to accommodate her training, and whether he could teach her to accompany him on his wilderness travels. The prospect of long-term companionship both thrilled and terrified him. For 15 years, he'd protected himself from the pain of loss by avoiding attachments entirely. Now he'd allowed this small creature to slip past his defenses with embarrassing ease, and he was discovering that caring about someone again awakened vulnerabilities he'd thought safely buried. As Lucky grew stronger and more active, Will began to understand that she had brought more than companionship into his isolated existence. She had brought questions that demanded answers, mysteries that challenged his understanding of his own story, and most dangerously of all, she had brought hope for possibilities he'd convinced himself he no longer wanted. But he was beginning to suspect that Lucky knew things about those possibilities that he didn't, and that she had come to his cabin for reasons far more complex than simple accident or chance. 3 weeks into Lucky's recovery, Will found himself doing something he hadn't done since the war ended, talking about Thomas. It started accidentally one evening while he was carving Lucky a proper feeding bowl from a piece of seasoned pine. The rhythmic motion of the knife reminded him of countless evenings when he and his brother had whittled by firelight, competing to see who could create the most intricate designs. "My brother Thomas was better at this than me," Will said aloud, surprised by the words as they left his mouth. Lucky looked up from her position near the fire, ears alert, had steadier hands, more patience for detail work, could carve a whistle that sounded like a real bird singing. Lucky's reaction to the word whistle was immediate. She rose and approached Will, settling beside his chair with an attentiveness that seemed almost human in its intensity. Encouraged by her interest, Will continued working and talking. Thomas made his first whistle when he was 12, spent 3 weeks getting the holes just right, testing the pitch until it matched the meadowlark song perfectly. Used to play it every morning while we did chores. Will's hands stilled on the carving, took that whistle with him to war, said it reminded him of home when things got bad. The wooden bowl and Will's hands had taken on a pleasing shape, smooth and deep enough to hold Lucky's meals. As he worked, more memories surfaced, stories he'd buried so deeply that speaking them aloud felt like archaeology of the heart. Thomas could talk to any animal, seemed like. Had a way with horses that made the old-timers shake their heads in wonder. Dogs followed him home from town regular, much to Mother's dismay. She used to say he was going to turn our farm into a menagerie if she didn't keep watch on him. Lucky whined softly, a sound that seemed to encourage him to continue. Will set down his carving and looked into the fire, seeing memories in the dancing flames. He wanted to be a veterinarian after the war. Had it all planned out, study in Chicago, come back to Nebraska, and set up practice helping farmers with their livestock. Said there was more honor in saving lives than taking them. Will's voice grew quiet. Guess we both learned that lesson the hard way. That night, Will retrieved the carved whistle from the chest and sat with it in his hands, studying the craftsmanship. The work was indeed excellent, each hole precisely placed, the wood smooth from years of handling. When he raised it to his lips and blew a gentle note, Lucky's response was immediate and heartbreaking. She approached slowly, whining with what sounded like recognition and longing. "You know this tune, don't you, girl?" Will played a simple melody, watching Lucky's reactions. "Someone played music like this for you, someone who cared about you enough to teach you to love it." The questions that had been building in his mind crystallized into uncomfortable certainties. Lucky had belonged to someone skilled and patient, someone who'd taken time to train her properly and expose her to music and craftsmanship. Her mysterious arrival at his cabin wasn't random. She'd been seeking something specific, or perhaps someone specific. Over the following days, Will began to notice patterns in Bella, Lucky's behavior that he'd initially dismissed as puppy curiosity. She showed particular interest in certain areas of the cabin, especially the corners and spaces where previous owners might have left belongings. Her investigation wasn't random exploration, it was methodical, purposeful, as if she was searching for something she expected to find. More telling was her reaction to different scents and materials. When Will brought out leather goods, his gun belt, saddlebags or boots, Lucky would investigate them with intense focus, often seeming disappointed when they didn't meet whatever criteria she was applying. Similarly, anything metal received careful examination, from his traps and tools to the simple utensils he used for eating. "What are you looking for, Lucky?" he asked one morning, watching her nose through a collection of odds and ends he'd found in the cabin's corners. "What do you think should be here?" Her frustration was becoming more apparent as her health improved and her energy returned. She would complete her searches of familiar areas, then sit and stare toward the western mountains with an intensity that made Will's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Something in her posture reminded him of soldiers waiting for delayed reinforcements, hoping against evidence that help was still coming. The western mountains. Will had avoided thinking too carefully about what lay in that direction, but Lucky's consistent attention to those peaks forced him to consider possibilities he'd been reluctant to face. 40 miles west, beyond the hardest terrain in the territory, lay old mining country, where prospectors had worked claims until the easy gold played out. Most had moved on to richer strikes in California or Colorado, but some had stayed, convinced that patience and persistence would reveal hidden wealth. Thomas had always been fascinated by those stories. During their last conversations before the war, he'd spoken of his intention to try his hand at prospecting after completing his veterinary studies. "There's gold in them hills, Will," he'd said with the enthusiasm that made everything seem possible when Thomas believed in it. "Just need to know where to look and have the patience to do the work." Will had dismissed such talk as youthful optimism, but now he wondered if Thomas had been more serious about those plans than he'd realized. The timing was unsettling, Lucky's arrival, her obvious familiarity with human companionship, her reaction to music and crafted objects, her persistent attention to the western mountains, where old prospecting claims lay scattered across remote valleys. "Thomas died at Spotsylvania," Will told Lucky firmly, as if speaking the words aloud could silence the doubts growing in his mind. "I carried his body from that battlefield myself, wrote the letter to our parents. There's no mystery here, girl. Whatever you're looking for, it's not connected to my brother." But even as he spoke, Will remembered details that had nagged at him for years. The confusion of that battle, the smoke and chaos that had made identification difficult, the burial detail that had been overwhelmed by casualties, the rushed processing that left little time for careful verification. He'd been so consumed by grief and shock that he hadn't questioned the efficiency of military bureaucracy. Lucky's response to his declaration was a steady, almost reproachful stare that made him profoundly uncomfortable. She seemed to be waiting for him to reach conclusions she'd already drawn, and her patience carried the weight of certainty that disturbed his carefully constructed understanding of his own history. That evening, as he watched Lucky settle near the fire with the wooden whistle positioned carefully beside her, she'd claimed it as her own personal treasure. Will forced himself to confront the possibility that his isolation hadn't been as complete as he'd believed. Perhaps his brother's spirit had never really left these mountains. Perhaps the past had ways of reaching forward that he'd never considered. Perhaps Lucky hadn't found his cabin by accident at all. By the 4th week of Lucky's recovery, her restlessness had become impossible to ignore. She would position herself at the cabin's western window each morning, watching the distant peaks with an intensity that spoke of purpose rather than idle curiosity. When Will approached to check what had captured her attention, she would look up at him with eyes that seemed to hold questions he couldn't begin to answer. "What's got you so interested in those mountains, girl?" he asked one afternoon, following her gaze toward the snow-capped ridges that marked the boundary of his familiar territory. Nothing out there but old mining claims and hard country. Lucky's ears perked at the word mining, and she turned to face him with renewed alertness. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable, like a key turning in a lock Will hadn't known existed. That evening, driven by a combination of curiosity and growing unease, Will decided to explore areas of his property he'd largely ignored during his years of residence. The cabin had come with several outbuildings, a small barn, a tool shed, and a root cellar, but he'd never thoroughly investigated their contents. His own possessions had been sufficient for his needs, and he'd seen no reason to disturb whatever the previous owners had left behind. Lucky followed him as he lit a lantern and began a systematic search of the shed. Beneath dust-covered tarps and behind stacks of seasoned firewood, he discovered equipment that told stories of the cabin's earlier inhabitants. There were mining tools, picks, shovels, and several gold pans of varying sizes, along with the kind of detailed maps and survey equipment that suggested serious prospecting efforts rather than casual hobby work. Lucky's reaction to these discoveries was immediate and intense. She investigated each piece of equipment with the thoroughness of an expert appraiser, paying particular attention to a battered gold pan that showed clear signs of extensive use. When Will lifted it for closer examination, Lucky whined and positioned herself directly in front of him, as if claiming ownership of the artifact. "This means something to you?" Will asked, studying the pan's worn surface. The metal showed the characteristic scratches and dents that came from years of patient work in rocky streams. Around the rim, someone had scratched crude initials that were still barely visible beneath the accumulated patina. T.C. Will's hands began to shake. Thomas Cutter, his brother's initials, carved into a prospecting pan found in a shed on property 40 miles from the nearest settlement, in exactly the direction Lucky had been staring with such persistent interest. "That's not possible," he whispered, but even as he spoke the words, other pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. The carved whistle that had triggered Lucky's recognition, her familiarity with human customs and training, her purposeful search behavior and obvious attachment to mining equipment. Lucky seemed to sense his distress and moved closer, pressing against his legs with the solid comfort of her growing body. Her presence was reassuring, but it also confirmed his growing suspicion that she knew far more about these discoveries than a young dog should be able to understand. Will spent the next hour cataloguing the shed's contents with the methodical thoroughness of a man trying to prove himself wrong. Along with the mining equipment, he found personal belongings that painted a picture of someone who'd lived on the property for an extended period. There were clothes suitable for mountain weather, cooking utensils designed for camp life, and most telling of all, a collection of books on geology and mining techniques. Inside one of the books, a technical manual on placer, mining methods. Will found a letter that stopped his breathing entirely. The paper was weathered and stained, but the handwriting was unmistakably familiar. He'd seen it countless times on letters home, during their military service, on notes passed between brothers, during quiet moments in camp. "Will," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means Lucky found you like I taught her to. I don't know if I'll live long enough to see you again, but I wanted you to know the truth about what happened after Spotsylvania." Will's legs gave out, and he sat heavily on a crate of mining supplies, the letter trembling in his hands. Lucky moved to sit directly in front of him, her dark eyes holding a gravity that seemed far beyond her months. "I wasn't killed in that battle, brother. Wounded bad, yes, and left for dead when our line broke. But a field medic found me breathing and got me to a surgeon who was too tired to write proper reports. I woke up weeks later in a hospital with no memory of my own name, let alone yours." The letter continued in Thomas's familiar voice, explaining months of confusion and gradual recovery in military hospitals that were overwhelmed by casualties. By the time he'd regained enough memory to identify himself, Will had long since been mustered out and disappeared into the Western Territories. I tried to find you, Will. Spent 2 years following cold trails and asking questions in every settlement between Nebraska and California. Finally gave up and decided to make my own way in these mountains, figuring if I was meant to stay lost, at least I could make something of myself before I died for real. Lucky whined softly, and Will reached down to stroke her head, his vision blurred by tears he hadn't shed since the day he'd carried what he thought was Thomas's body from that bloody battlefield. I found gold, Will. More gold than 2 men could spend in 10 lifetimes, hidden in a canyon that most folks would never think to explore. But finding wealth isn't the same as finding family, and I've been lonelier than any man has a right to be. So I got myself a companion, a smart little pup I named Lucky, because she brought good fortune into my empty life. Will looked down at Lucky with new understanding. She wasn't just a dog who'd wandered into his cabin seeking shelter. She was Thomas's dog, trained by his brother to seek out specific scents and sounds, taught to recognize the kind of man who would care for her if something happened to her master. I trained her to find you if I couldn't manage it myself, the letter continued. Taught her your scent from old letters I carried, played her melodies on the whistle you gave me before the war. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and she's completed the mission I gave her. The letter concluded with detailed directions to Thomas's hidden camp and the location of the gold strike he'd been working. But more importantly, it ended with words that lifted a weight from Will's shoulders that he'd carried for 15 years. I don't blame you for anything that happened in the war, Will. I never did. I hope you'll forgive yourself the way I forgave you long ago, and I hope you'll take care of Lucky the way she took care of me. She's the best friend a man could ask for, and now she's yours. Love, your brother, Thomas. Will sat in the dusty shed, holding his brother's letter while Lucky pressed against his legs, both of them mourning and celebrating the resolution of a mystery that had shaped both their lives. Thomas was truly gone now, but he'd left behind more than gold. He'd left behind a living bridge between past and future, a loyal companion who carried love from the dead to the living. Will spent the entire night reading and rereading Thomas's letter, studying every word until he had it memorized. By dawn, he'd made his decision. Lucky had completed the first part of her mission by finding him. Now it was time to honor the second part by following her to wherever Thomas had made his final home. The morning light revealed Lucky positioned at the western window again, but this time her vigil had a different quality. She seemed to sense that something fundamental had changed, that the long period of waiting and searching was finally coming to an end. When Will approached with Thomas's prospecting gear in his hands, her tail began a slow, purposeful wag. "All right, girl," he said, his voice rough with emotion and determination. "Show me where he is." Lucky's response was immediate. She moved to the door and sat with the kind of patient alertness that spoke of countless similar moments with Thomas. This was familiar territory for her, the ritual of preparation before heading into the wilderness on important business. Will spent the morning gathering supplies for what he knew would be a challenging journey. Thomas's directions mentioned a hidden canyon, 2 days' hard travel west of the cabin, beyond the lightning split, pine, and past the creek that runs backwards. The landmarks were cryptic, but specific enough to suggest Thomas had been careful about keeping his location secret. Among the mining equipment, Will found a partial map drawn on water-stained paper, showing a route through mountain passes he'd never explored. The cartography was precise, marked with elevations and water sources, but it covered territory that stretched beyond his familiar hunting grounds into wilderness that most travelers avoided entirely. The map fragment would serve as their guide, but Will understood that Lucky would be their true navigator. She'd made this journey before, probably many times, and her eagerness suggested she remembered every landmark and turning. As he packed supplies into saddlebags and a heavy backpack, Will found himself talking to Lucky about the challenges ahead. "It's going to be rough country, girl. Cold nights, difficult terrain, and we'll be carrying everything we need on our backs. You, sure you're up for this? Lucky's response was to trot to the door and scratch at it with clear impatience. Whatever hardships lay ahead, she was ready to face them. Her mission had been interrupted by winter and her own near death. But now that she'd recovered and found her target, nothing was going to keep her from completing what Thomas had asked of her. Will checked and double-checked his preparations. Food for 5 days, assuming they could supplement with hunting and fishing. Warm bedding suitable for high-altitude camping. Tools for basic repairs and emergency situations. His rifle and ammunition, more for protection against the occasional mountain cat than for hunting, though he brought fishing gear in case they needed to extend their food supplies. Most importantly, he packed Thomas's letter and the mining equipment they'd discovered, including the gold pan that had served as the key to this mystery. If they were truly heading toward a significant gold strike, he wanted to be prepared to understand what Thomas had found and why it had kept him in these remote mountains for so many years. The weather was cooperating, clear skies with the kind of crisp mountain air that promised good traveling conditions. Will had learned to read the signs that preceded the sudden storms that could make mountain travel deadly, and everything suggested they had at least a few days of stable conditions ahead. Lucky supervised his preparations with the focused attention of an experienced traveler. When he reached for items that weren't suitable for wilderness travel, she would position herself between him and the object, as if offering gentle correction. When he packed essentials, she would wag approvingly and move on to inspect the next item. "Thomas taught you well," Will murmured, watching her evaluate his gear selection with obvious expertise. "How many times did you make this trip with him? How many times did he talk about the day when you'd bring me back to see what he'd found?" The questions led to darker thoughts about Thomas's final days. The letter had been written in a strong, clear hand that suggested good health. But how long ago had Thomas penned those words? What had happened to him in the time since Lucky left his camp to seek Will? Had he died alone in the wilderness, hoping until the end that his loyal companion would successfully complete her mission? Lucky seemed to sense his growing melancholy and approached to press against his legs with the solid comfort of her presence. Her dark eyes held something that might have been understanding, as if she knew exactly what he was thinking and wanted to reassure him that whatever they found at their destination, they would face it together. By mid-morning, they were ready to depart. Will shouldered his pack, secured Thomas's prospecting gear to his belt, and took a final look around the cabin that had been his refuge for 15 years. When he returned, if he returned, he suspected he would be a different man than the one who was leaving. Lucky led the way from the moment they stepped outside, moving with confidence toward a faint trail that disappeared into thick pine forest. The path was barely visible, overgrown from disuse, but Lucky navigated it with the certainty of long familiarity. Within an hour, they were deeper into the wilderness than Will had ventured since his first explorations of the territory. The terrain grew increasingly challenging as they climbed toward the high passes marked on Thomas's map. Rocky switchbacks gave way to narrow ledges that required careful footing, especially with a heavy pack. Lucky moved ahead, occasionally looking back to ensure Will was following, her pace perfectly calibrated to match his capabilities while still making steady progress. As they gained elevation, the view behind them revealed the full scope of their isolation. Will's cabin had already disappeared into the forest below, and the nearest signs of human habitation were lost in the vast expanse of wilderness that stretched toward the eastern horizon. Whatever lay ahead, they were committed now to following this path to its conclusion. Lucky paused at a narrow creek crossing, allowing Will to catch his breath while she investigated scents along the water's edge. Her behavior suggested recognition. This was clearly a familiar landmark on the route to Thomas's hidden camp. When she looked up at him, her expression held both anticipation and something that might have been sorrow, as if she understood they were approaching the end of a long journey that would bring both answers and grief. "Lead on, girl," Will said softly, adjusting his pack and preparing for whatever revelations waited in the hidden canyon ahead. Take me to my brother. 2 days of hard climbing brought them to the lightning-split pine Thomas had described in his directions, a massive ponderosa that had been struck years ago, leaving a distinctive scar that split the trunk nearly in half, while somehow allowing the tree to survive and continue growing. Lucky's excitement increased visibly when they reached this landmark, her tail wagging with the kind of enthusiasm Will had rarely seen since her recovery. The final approach to Thomas's camp followed a creek that did indeed seem to run backwards, flowing uphill through a geological formation that defied common sense. Lucky bounded ahead now, her restraint abandoned in favor of pure eagerness. She would run 50 yards forward, then return to Will as if urging him to move faster, before racing ahead again. When they finally crested the ridge that overlooked Thomas's hidden canyon, Will stopped dead in his tracks, overwhelmed by what he saw below. The canyon was a perfect natural fortress, accessible only through the narrow pass they'd just navigated. Steep walls rose on 3 sides, creating a protected valley that was invisible from any direction except the specific approach Thomas had mapped. A clear stream meandered through the center, fed by a waterfall that cascaded from the western cliff face. Most remarkably, the entire valley floor was marked by the kind of methodical excavation that spoke of serious mining operations. But it was the campsite itself that drove the breath from Will's lungs. Thomas had built more than a simple prospector's shelter. A well-constructed log cabin occupied a natural terrace above the stream, complete with a stone chimney, glass windows, and the kind of careful craftsmanship that suggested years of patient work. Gardens surrounded the cabin, now overgrown, but clearly once productive, and a series of outbuildings included what appeared to be a workshop, storage areas, and mining facilities. Lucky raced down the slope toward the cabin, barking with pure joy. Her cries echoed off the canyon walls, and for a moment Will could imagine how this hidden valley might have sounded when Thomas was alive, filled with the sounds of human activity and canine companionship. As Will approached the cabin, he realized that Thomas had been dead for only a matter of weeks, not months or years, as he'd feared. The structure was well maintained, the windows were intact, and smoke stains on the chimney suggested recent use. More telling, supplies were neatly organized and protected from weather, as if Thomas had expected to return from a brief absence. Lucky led him directly to the cabin's front door, which stood slightly ajar. Inside, Will found evidence of the life his brother had built in this remote sanctuary. The main room was larger and more comfortable than his own cabin, furnished with handmade chairs and tables that demonstrated Thomas's skill as a craftsman. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books on geology, mining, animal husbandry, and even veterinary medicine. Thomas had never abandoned his dream of working with animals, but it was the personal touches that broke Will's heart. Photographs in handmade frames showed Thomas with Lucky at various stages of her growth, documenting their partnership over what appeared to be more than a year. A carefully maintained journal recorded daily activities, weather patterns, mining progress, and most poignantly, entries about training. Lucky to search for his missing brother. Day 127, Lucky responded well to scent training today. She can identify Will's smell from old letters with 90% accuracy. Beginning navigation training tomorrow. Day 203, Lucky completed the round trip to the valley entrance in record time. She's ready for longer expeditions if needed. Day 341, my cough is getting worse. Doc in Beaver Creek says it's miner's lung, common enough in this work. Lucky seems to sense something's wrong. She won't leave my side for more than a few minutes. Will's hands shook as he read entry after entry, documenting Thomas's deteriorating health and Lucky's increasing protectiveness. The final entries, written just weeks ago, revealed the truth about Thomas's death and Lucky's desperate mission. Day 398, can barely breathe today. Lucky brought me fresh water from the spring. Smart girl. If I don't make it through this bout, she knows what to do. Trained her well enough that she'll find Will, even if it takes months of searching. Day 402. This might be my last entry. Fever's too high, and the coughing fits are getting worse. Lucky's been incredible, brings me food, water, even tries to keep me warm at night. She understands that I'm dying, I think. Animals know these things better than humans. Day 403. Lucky left this morning heading east. I told her to go find Will, and she looked at me with those smart eyes like she understood every word. Probably did. If anyone's reading this, it means she succeeded. Will, if this is you, take care of our girl. She saved my life more times than I can count, and now she's saving yours too, by bringing you here. The gold's real, brother, but Lucky's worth more than any treasure. Love, of you both. Thomas. The journal entries were accompanied by detailed maps showing the location of Thomas's gold finds throughout the canyon. The strike was even larger than his letter had suggested, multiple productive sites that had yielded enough raw gold to fill several leather pouches hidden throughout the cabin. But the most significant discovery awaited Will in a wooden chest beside Thomas's bed. Inside, carefully preserved in oiled leather, was a collection of Thomas's personal effects, his discharge papers from the army, which explained how he'd survived Spotsylvania, letters he'd written but never sent to Will, and most remarkably, a photograph of the two brothers taken before the war, young and optimistic, and unaware of the grief that lay ahead. Wrapped with the photograph was a leather pouch containing Thomas's most precious possession, their father's pocket watch, the one that was supposed to be buried with Thomas after Spotsylvania. The watch was still running, kept, wound and maintained with the same care Thomas had shown to everything he valued. Lucky had positioned herself beside the chest, while Will examined its contents, as if she understood the significance of these artifacts to both brothers. When Will lifted the pocket watch, she whined softly and pressed closer, offering comfort in the way she'd learned during Thomas's final illness. "He's really gone, isn't he, girl?" Will whispered, holding the watch against his ear and listening to its steady tick, the sound of time continuing despite loss, despite grief, despite the end of stories that had seemed too important to conclude. Lucky's response was to move to the cabin door and look back at him expectantly. Her mission wasn't complete yet. She'd brought him to Thomas's camp as instructed, but there was more to show him, more that Thomas had wanted his brother to understand about the life he'd built in this hidden valley. Will followed Lucky outside, where she led him to the mining sites Thomas had developed along the stream. The work was impressive, carefully engineered sluices and dams that maximized gold recovery while minimizing environmental damage. This wasn't the desperate scratching of a man seeking quick wealth, but the patient labor of someone who understood that the real treasure lay in building something sustainable. As the afternoon sun slanted through the canyon, casting long shadows across Thomas's abandoned paradise, Will began to understand the true scope of what his brother had accomplished. Thomas hadn't just found gold, he'd created a new life, complete with purpose, companionship, and the kind of peace that Will had been seeking in his own isolation for 15 years. But Thomas had also understood that wealth without family was just an elaborate form of loneliness. That's why he'd trained Lucky to complete this mission, why he'd preserved every memento that connected him to his brother, why he'd spent his final conscious moments ensuring that Will would eventually inherit not just gold, but the dog who had been Thomas's truest companion. Lucky had fulfilled her promise to a dying man, and now it was Will's turn to decide what to do with the gifts she'd brought him: a brother's love reaching across death, a fortune beyond his wildest dreams, and a loyal companion who had already proven she would journey through hell itself to keep faith with those she loved. Will spent 3 days in Thomas's hidden valley, reading every page of his brother's journal and absorbing the full magnitude of what Thomas had accomplished in his years of exile. The leather-bound journal served as a window into a transformed life, not just the record of a prospector's work, but the testament of a man who had found peace after war, purpose after loss, and love in the unlikely form of a loyal dog who had become his family. The journal entries painted a picture of Thomas's gradual healing from the trauma that had scattered both brothers to the winds. Unlike Will, who had chosen isolation as a shield against further pain, Thomas had embraced solitude as an opportunity for rebuilding. His daily entries documented not just mining activities and weather patterns, but also his growing understanding of himself and his place in the world. Day 89. Lucky and I watched a family of deer drink from the stream this morning. Made me think about what family really means. Not just blood relations, but the bonds you choose to honor and protect. Lucky chose me, and I chose her back. That's family enough for any man. Day 156. Found a new vein today that's richer than anything I've seen yet. But the real treasure isn't the gold, it's having someone to share the excitement with. Lucky danced around the claim marker like she understood we'd struck it rich. Maybe she did. Day 234. Been thinking about Will more lately. Wonder if he blames himself for what happened at Spotsylvania. Hope he knows it wasn't his fault that I fell behind the line. War makes survivors out of some and casualties out of others, but it doesn't make heroes out of anybody. We were both just boys trying to stay alive. These entries revealed the depth of Thomas's emotional recovery and his growing desire to reconnect with the brother he'd lost to grief and isolation. The journal documented multiple attempts to locate Will, including trips to settlements throughout the territory and correspondence with military records offices that might have tracked his movements. Day 267. Jake Morrison at Beaver Creek thinks he knows which cabin Will's been living in, 40 miles east, up in the high country, where a man can disappear completely if that's what he wants. Jake says the fellow who lives there matches Will's description, keeps to himself, trades quality pelts, doesn't socialize with anybody. That sounds like my brother, all right. Day 298. Tried to approach Will's cabin today, but couldn't work up the courage to knock on his door. What if he doesn't want to see me? What if knowing I survived makes his grief worse instead of better? Maybe some dead should stay dead, even when they're walking around breathing. Will's chest tightened as he read about Thomas's failed attempt to reunite with him directly. His brother had been close enough to touch, watching Will's cabin from the tree line, struggling with the same fears and uncertainties that had kept Will locked in emotional exile for 15 years. But the journal also revealed Thomas's growing determination to bridge that gap, even if it required unconventional methods. The entries documenting Lucky's training weren't just about teaching a dog to follow scents and navigate terrain. They were about creating a living message that could carry love across the barriers that human fear and pride had erected. Day 312. Lucky completed her first solo trip to Will's Valley today. She can make the journey in 18 hours if she pushes hard, and she's smart, enough to avoid the dangerous terrain that stops most travelers. More importantly, she understands that finding Will is her primary mission. I've never seen an animal so focused on completing a task. Day 345. My cough is getting worse, but Lucky's training is nearly complete. She knows Will's scent from the letters I saved. She can navigate the route to his cabin in any weather, and she's smart enough to stay with him once she finds him. If something happens to me, she'll bring him here to see what I've built. That's the best gift I can give. Either of them. Reading these entries, Will began to understand the true scope of Thomas's plan. This wasn't just about sharing a gold strike or reuniting estranged brothers. Thomas had been creating a bridge between isolation and connection, between the man Will had become and the man he might yet choose to be. The financial aspect of Thomas's discovery was staggering. His detailed records showed consistent yields that had produced enough gold to support comfortable living for multiple lifetimes. But more impressive than the wealth was the sustainable system Thomas had developed for extracting it. Every operation was carefully planned to minimize environmental impact while maximizing long-term productivity. Day 357. The creek runs cleaner now than when I started working these claims. Learned that from the old crow hunter who showed me this valley in the first place. Take only what you need, give back more than you take, and the land will provide for your children's children. Lucky's learning the same lessons. Thomas had also developed relationships with the scattered native communities in the region, trading fairly and learning traditional mining techniques that were more efficient and less destructive than the strip mining methods used by most prospectors. His journal recorded detailed conversations with tribal elders who had shared knowledge about reading mineral signs and working with the land rather than against it. Day 378. Chief Running Bear visited again today. He says the spirits of this place approve of how I've been working the claims. According to their traditions, gold that's taken with respect and gratitude brings good fortune to the miner and his family. I think he knows about Will somehow keeps asking when my brother will join me in this valley. The spiritual dimension of Thomas's work became increasingly apparent as Will read deeper into the journal. His brother had found more than financial security in this hidden canyon. He'd discovered a sense of purpose that connected him to something larger than his own survival. Day 392. Lucky and I spent the morning watching eagles fish in the pool below the waterfall. Made me think about patience and timing. The eagles don't rush or force the catch, they wait for the right moment, then act with complete commitment. That's how I want to approach bringing Will here. When Lucky goes to find him, it'll be because the timing. It is right for both of them. But the final entries revealed Thomas's growing awareness that his time was running out. The miner's lung that eventually killed him had been progressing for months, and his preparations for Lucky's mission became increasingly urgent as his health deteriorated. Day 395. Can barely work the claims anymore, but I can still teach Lucky what she needs to know. She understands that something's wrong with me, keeps bringing me things she thinks will help. Yesterday it was a piece of gold ore from our richest claim, like she thought wealth could cure sickness. Smart dog, but she doesn't understand that some problems can't be solved with treasure. Day 399. Made my final preparations today. Lucky knows the route to Will's cabin by heart. She's got enough supplies cached along the way to survive the journey, and she's smart enough to stay with him once she finds him. If I die tomorrow, she'll complete her mission. That's all any man can ask to know his work will continue after he's gone. Day 400. This might be my last chance to write clearly. Lucky's sleeping beside me, keeping me warm like she has every night since she was a pup. She saved my life, just by being here, giving me something to care about, besides my own pain. Now she's going to save Will's life too, though he probably doesn't know he needs saving yet. The journal concluded with a letter addressed directly to Will, written in Thomas's increasingly shaky handwriting, but conveying a clarity of purpose that transcended physical weakness. Brother, if you're reading this, it means Lucky succeeded in her mission, and you found your way to our valley. I say our, because everything here belongs to both of us now. The gold, the claims, the cabin, but most importantly, Lucky herself. She's been my family for more than a year, and now she's yours. Take care of her the way she took care of me, and she'll show you possibilities you never imagined. I don't know what kind of life you've been living since the war ended, but I hope you'll consider staying here, at least for a while. This valley has a way of healing wounds that seem too deep to mend. The work is honest, the solitude is peaceful, and Lucky makes everything better just by being present. You might find that the brother you thought you lost is still here, waiting in the man you can choose to become. The gold is real, and there's enough of it to change everything. But don't let wealth become another form of isolation. Use it to build connections, to help others, to create something meaningful that extends beyond your own life. That's what Thomas the boy would have wanted, and that's what Thomas the man is asking you to remember. As Will read these final words by lamplight in his brother's cabin, Lucky resting her head on his feet in exactly the way she must have comforted Thomas during his last days. He felt 15 years of carefully constructed emotional barriers finally crumbling. The bit gold was extraordinary, but the real treasure was the opportunity to honor his brother's love by choosing connection over isolation, hope over despair, and the courage to build a new life from the ashes of the old one. Tomorrow, he would begin the work of claiming Thomas's legacy, not just the wealth, but the wisdom that had created it. On the fourth morning in Thomas's Valley, Will woke with absolute certainty about what needed to be done. Lucky had spent the night curled against his side, and when he opened his eyes, she was already watching him with the patient alertness that had become her signature expression. It was as if she'd been waiting for him to reach the same understanding she'd possessed all along. "Today we honor him properly," Will said aloud, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "Today we do what he would have wanted." Will began by exploring every corner of Thomas's operation, understanding the full scope of what his brother had accomplished. The mining tools scattered throughout the claims were not just functional implements, but carefully maintained instruments that spoke of years of dedicated work. Among them, Will found a complete set of prospecting equipment that Thomas had obviously prepared specifically for him, tools sized for Will's hands, marked with his initials, and maintained in perfect working condition despite never having been used. The centerpiece of this collection was a gold pan that took Will's breath away. Unlike the battered pan they'd found in the shed, this one was pristine, crafted from the finest materials available and engraved with both brothers' names around the rim. Beneath the names, Thomas had inscribed a simple message: "For the work we'll do together." "He never stopped believing we'd be reunited," Will murmured, running his fingers over the careful engraving. Lucky approached and sniffed the pan with obvious recognition. She'd watched Thomas create this gift during the long evenings when his cough kept him awake. Following Thomas's detailed maps, Will made his way to the richest claim. His brother had identified a bend in the stream where the water slowed enough to deposit the heaviest sediment in a natural collection point. Thomas's journal had marked this spot as promise, and his notes indicated it had consistently produced the largest nuggets and finest gold dust. The claim showed clear evidence of systematic work. Thomas had built a sophisticated sluice system that channeled water through carefully constructed channels, allowing gravity to separate gold from worthless sediment. The engineering was elegant in its simplicity, a testament to Thomas's practical intelligence and his commitment to working with natural forces rather than against them. Will began the ceremonial process of working the claim, using Thomas's specially prepared tools to extract gold in exactly the way his brother had intended. Each pan of gravel yielded flakes and small nuggets that gleamed like captured sunlight in the clear mountain water. But more than the wealth itself, the rhythm of the work connected Will to his brother's daily experience, the patient satisfaction of honest labor that produced tangible results. Lucky positioned herself strategically throughout the morning, sometimes watching the work with obvious approval, other times investigating sections of the claim that Thomas's notes had marked as particularly promising. Her behavior suggested she understood the significance of this moment, not just as mining work, but as Will's formal acceptance of the legacy Thomas had prepared for him. As the sun reached its peak, Will had extracted enough gold to fill a small leather pouch, more wealth than most men saw in a lifetime, pulled from a single morning's work at one claim among several that Thomas had developed. The immediate financial implications were staggering, but the emotional weight was even greater. This wasn't just gold, it was Thomas's faith in their eventual reunion, his confidence that Will would eventually choose connection over isolation, his brother's love made tangible in the form of precious metal that would provide security and opportunity for whatever came next. Will paused his work to examine the largest nugget he'd found, a piece nearly the size of a walnut that had been wedged beneath a larger rock. The gold was incredibly pure, requiring no processing to reveal its brilliant natural color. As he held it up to the sunlight, he could imagine Thomas's excitement when he'd first discovered this rich deposit, the joy he would have felt knowing he could finally offer his brother something valuable beyond mere reunion. "This one's for you, brother," Will said quietly, setting the nugget aside from the others. "This one gets made into something permanent, something that keeps your memory alive." Lucky approached as he spoke, pressing against his legs in the comforting gesture that had become her way of offering emotional support. She seemed to understand that this moment marked a turning point, not just in Will's financial circumstances, but in his willingness to engage with life beyond mere survival. The morning's work had proven that Thomas's claims were as rich as his journal suggested, but more importantly, it had demonstrated that Will was capable of stepping into the life his brother had envisioned for him. The tools felt right in his hands. The work satisfied something deep in his soul that had been empty for too long, and Lucky's presence made every moment feel like a collaboration rather than solitary labor. As clouds began to gather over the canyon walls, threatening afternoon rain that would make mining work impossible, Will carefully secured his morning's yield and prepared to return to the cabin. Tomorrow he would work the claims more systematically, following Thomas's proven methods to extract the wealth that would fund whatever future he chose to build. But tonight he had more important work to complete: the emotional labor of fully accepting what Thomas had given him and deciding how to honor that gift in the years ahead. That evening, as rain drummed gently on the cabin's roof, Will sat at Thomas's workbench with the large gold nugget he'd set aside that morning. Using tools he found carefully arranged in the workshop, he began the delicate process of shaping the raw gold into something that would serve as a permanent memorial to his brother's love and sacrifice. The work required patience and precision, qualities that 15 years of solitary mountain living had taught Will in abundance. As he heated and shaped the malleable metal, memories of Thomas flowed through his mind with the clarity of mountain water. Not the painful images of war and loss that had haunted him for so long, but older, sweeter recollections of the brother who had shaped his understanding of loyalty, courage, and hope. Thomas teaching him to carve whistles from green wood, their father's patient corrections as they learned to shape the tone holes just right. Thomas defending him from schoolyard bullies, despite being the younger brother, his fierce protectiveness, overcoming any consideration of size or odds. Thomas's excitement about their future plans, his absolute confidence that they would face whatever challenges life offered as a team, brothers united against the world's uncertainties. Lucky settled beside the workbench, watching Will's careful craftsmanship with the same attentive interest she'd shown during Thomas's work. Her presence provided a living bridge between past and present, connecting the brother Will had lost with the legacy he was now prepared to claim. As the gold took shape under his hands, Will began to understand the true magnitude of what Thomas had accomplished in this hidden valley. The wealth was extraordinary, but the real achievement was the peace Thomas had found, the way he'd transformed. His isolation from a punishment into a gift, solitude from emptiness into fullness. He wasn't hiding from life, was he, girl? Will asked quietly, testing the weight and balance of the pendant he was creating. He was preparing for it, building something worth sharing when the right moment came. The pendant emerged from his work as a simple but elegant piece, the gold shaped into an oval that would rest comfortably against his chest, polished to a warm glow that captured and reflected firelight. On one side, he carefully engraved Thomas's initials and the dates of his birth and death. On the other, he carved a simple image of a mountain peak, symbolizing the heights Thomas had reached in both literal and spiritual terms. When the pendant was complete, Will strung it on a leather cord and hung it around his neck. The weight was substantial but comfortable, a constant reminder of the love that had brought him to this moment and the responsibilities that came with Thomas's legacy. Lucky rose and approached him as he finished adjusting the cord, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight as she studied his face. Something in her expression seemed to convey approval, as if she recognized that he'd completed an important step in accepting the mission she'd been trained to fulfill. "Your job's done, isn't it?" Will said softly, reaching down to stroke her head. "You found me, brought me here, and now I understand what Thomas wanted me to know. You can rest now, girl. You've earned it." But even as he spoke the words, Will realized they weren't entirely true. Lucky's mission hadn't been simply to deliver him to Thomas's claims and disappear. She'd been trained to be his companion, his partner in whatever life he chose to build from this foundation. Thomas had understood that wealth without love was just an elaborate form of poverty, and he'd provided both the means and the companion necessary for Will to avoid that trap. The rain outside gradually diminished, leaving behind the kind of crystalline silence that only mountain country could provide. In that silence, Will heard something he'd forgotten existed, the sound of peace. Not the empty quiet of isolation, but the full silence of contentment, of being exactly where he belonged, with exactly the right companion beside him. For the first time since the war ended, Will felt complete. The guilt that had driven him into exile was finally balanced by the understanding of what Thomas had actually wanted, not eternal mourning, but the courage to build something meaningful from the ashes of shared loss. The gold would provide security and opportunity, but Lucky would provide something even more valuable: the daily reminder that love was stronger than loss, that loyalty could bridge even death, and that the most important treasures were the ones that couldn't be measured in weight or purity. As the fire burned low in the hearth, Will made his final decision about the future. He would honor Thomas's legacy, not by remaining in this hidden valley, but by returning to the world with the tools, both material and spiritual, that his brother had provided. The gold would fund good work, the kind of work that helped other broken soldiers find their way back to life. Lucky would be his constant reminder that connection was always possible, even for hearts that had convinced themselves they were permanently sealed. Thomas had saved them both, Will from a living death of isolation, and Lucky from the impossible burden of failing in her mission. Now it was Will's turn to carry that salvation forward, to plant seeds of hope and healing in soil that Thomas's love had prepared. The pendant rested warm against his chest as he banked the fire for the night, a golden promise that some bonds were indeed stronger than death, and that love, properly tended, could indeed lead to fortune beyond any prospector's wildest dreams. 6 months after Lucky led him to Thomas's hidden valley, Will stood on the front porch of a modest house in Helena, Montana, watching his companion teach a group of children the finer points of retrieving sticks from a muddy creek. The house served as both his residence and the headquarters for the Cutter Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping war veterans transition back to civilian life. The foundation had been Thomas's idea, though Will had discovered it only in the final pages of his brother's journal. "If I ever find you, brother, let's use whatever wealth comes our way to help the men who came home broken like we did. Nobody should have to spend 15 years in the wilderness just to learn how to be human again." Lucky's joyful barking echoed across the small yard as she demonstrated for the children how to approach a spooked horse, her patience and gentleness making her an ideal teacher for young minds that were still learning the boundaries between courage and caution. She'd adapted to town life with surprising ease, though Will suspected she missed the mountain silence on particularly noisy days. The transformation from hermit to community leader hadn't been without challenges. Will's first attempts at social interaction after so many years of isolation had been awkward affairs, marked by uncomfortable silences, and the kind of conversational rust that accumulates when a man stops practicing the art of human connection. But Lucky had served as an unexpected icebreaker, her obvious intelligence and gentle nature drawing people into conversations that might otherwise have withered before they began. The Foundation's work had attracted attention from across the territory, Veterans arrived weekly, some carried by families who'd exhausted other options, others walking in on their own initiative after hearing stories about the mountain man who'd found a way back to life with the help of a remarkable dog. Each man who came through their doors brought his own version of the same fundamental wound. The difficulty of finding purpose and peace after experiencing the worst that humanity could offer. Will's office contained reminders of both his past and his transformed future. Thomas's original journal occupied a place of honor on his desk, open to the page where his brother had first outlined his vision for helping other veterans. The walls displayed photographs documenting the Foundation's successes. Men who'd arrived broken and departed with renewed hope, families reunited after years of estrangement, and always Lucky positioned prominently in group photos, like the canine patron saint of second chances. But the most significant addition to Will's office was a professionally mounted photograph that had become the Foundation's unofficial symbol. It showed Will, Lucky, and Thomas, together a composite image created by a talented photographer who'd carefully combined a recent portrait of Will and Lucky with one of the photographs Thomas had kept in his hidden cabin. The three of them appeared to be standing together in Thomas's valley, united at last, despite the years and circumstances that had separated them. The financial foundation of their work remained strong. Thomas's claims continued to produce wealth that far exceeded their operational needs, allowing the Foundation to expand its services and reach. But Will had learned to view the gold as a tool rather than a treasure, a means of creating the connections and community that represented true wealth. Lucky's role in the Foundation's success extended far beyond her natural charm with visitors. She possessed an almost supernatural ability to identify which veterans were struggling most acutely with thoughts of self-harm, positioning herself beside troubled men with the same protective instincts she'd shown during Thomas's final illness. More than once, her refusal to leave a particular veteran's side had alerted Will to crisis situations that required immediate intervention. She knows. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the Foundation's physician, had observed after Lucky's behavior had prevented a suicide attempt by a young cavalry veteran. Animals can sense desperation in ways we humans miss. She's saving lives just by being present. The evening routine had become Will's favorite part of each day. After the staff departed and the last visitors returned to their lodgings in town, he and Lucky would sit on the front porch, sharing the kind of comfortable silence that spoke of absolute trust and mutual understanding. These quiet moments reminded Will of his early mornings in the mountain cabin, but the silence now held fullness rather than emptiness, possibility rather than resignation. Lucky would often bring him small tokens during these evening reflections. A smooth stone from the creek, a perfect pine cone from the yard's single pine tree, or occasionally a wildflower that she'd somehow managed to extract intact from the Foundation's modest garden. These offerings felt like tributes to the brood, memory of Thomas, tokens of remembrance from the dog who'd known them both, and understood that love could transcend even death. On this particular evening, as autumn painted the surrounding hills in shades of gold that reminded him of Thomas's hidden treasure, Will reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had led to this moment. A dying puppy crawling beneath his bed had seemed like a minor interruption to his isolated existence. Instead, it had been the beginning of a rescue mission that had ultimately saved them both. Lucky settled beside his chair as the sun disappeared behind the Helena Valley's western ridge, her graying muzzle a reminder that even the most loyal companions weren't permanent fixtures in the landscape of human affection. But the peace in her dark eyes suggested that she'd found the same contentment that now filled Will's previously empty heart. The Foundation's latest project involved establishing similar programs in other territories, spreading the model of healing that had emerged from Thomas's hidden valley across the American West. Veterans helping veterans, communities built around shared understanding of trauma and recovery. And always, the recognition that sometimes salvation arrived in the most unexpected packages. As night settled over Helena, Will touched the golden pendant that still rested against his chest, feeling its familiar weight and warmth. Thomas's gift had grown into something far greater than either brother had imagined, a legacy of healing that would touch hundreds of lives across generations yet to come. Lucky stirred beside him, and Will realized she was watching the western mountains with the same attentive expression that had first led him to Thomas's valley. But this time, her gaze held satisfaction rather than urgency, the peaceful observation of a mission completed and a promise fulfilled. Sometimes the most broken hearts do indeed find each other when they need it most.